Ralph had now been alone with the prisoner for hours, and no one had heard from him. When they went to check on him, they found the door was locked. They had to break it down. When they got inside, they could not believe what they saw. Shortly after 6 o'clock on the evening of Thursday, 29th of March, 1888, Constable Crowther of the Eccles Police received information that a suspicious-looking individual had been wandering the streets asking for the whereabouts of the Salvation Army captain's house and Mr. Alfred Pointer. P.C. Crowther ran to the address, and within an hour had concealed himself in the kitchen of the captain's house, and it was not long before he heard the scraping and heavy breathing of the sounds of someone climbing over the garden wall. The PC watched a shadow enter through the kitchen window. The intruder crept over the stone floor to the mantelpiece, where he examined some items. PC Crowther pounced and tackled the man to the ground. In the struggle, he managed to cuff and secure him, and upon searching him, he found the man had 2 crowbars wrapped in newspaper. The police officer had responded quickly and professionally upon receiving the initial tip-off, as he had recognised the arrival in town of 28-year-old John Jackson, an offender whose speciality was to burglarise the homes of the Salvation Army officers. The paper the next day gave a description of the prisoner, and also confirmed that he was wanted in Bradford, Hull and Oldham, and gave details of his criminal background. Jackson was a notorious criminal, who early in his career had been imprisoned for 6 months for horse stealing while serving in the army. He was also wanted for theft, bank robbery, where he stole £150. He was wanted for forgery and burglary, in which he was sent to Wakefield Prison, from which he escaped on the 9th of August 1883, while he was whitewashing a corridor. For some reason, he was left unsupervised. He then went upstairs and managed to steal a suit of clothes. He broke through a skylight and dropped down into the street. It was later found that he visited his home in Birstall, and then went on to Hull and other places, where he was employed as a navvy for about 2 months. However, he was recaptured and served out the remainder of his sentence at Armley Prison in Leeds, from which he was released in 1885. Neither rehabilitated nor deterred, his offending continued, and for the Eccles burglary he was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. Jackson was sent to Strangeways Prison in Manchester, where he seems to have settled into the prison regime without causing any problems. On the 22nd of May 1888, 45-year-old Ralph Dyer Webb kissed goodbye to his wife and ruffled the hair of his 6-year-old daughter. He closed the door to his home, 11 Albert Street, Broughton. He walked down the street with a smile on his face. Everything was going his way. He moved to Manchester from Cheltenham in Gloucestershire, and straight away got a job he really enjoyed. He was a warden at Strangeways Prison, and this was now his 11th year working there. He had also married a local girl, a girl of his dreams, 8 years ago at St Albans Church in Cheatwood, North Manchester. They were an older couple for marriage, him being 37 and Grace, his wife, being 32 at the time of the wedding, but it first took some time to win over her parents, Edward and Martha Barlow, which he did. And making his life feel more complete, he also had a 6-year-old daughter who was his world. He was happy at work, but he couldn't wait to get home that evening to see his little girl and talk to his wife about his day over his supper. But when he arrived at work and straightened out his uniform, he was sent to speak with the prison matron, Miss Elizabeth Little, as she had a job for him to do. He was to escort a prisoner, who was allegedly a plumber and a gas fitter, to go and repair a leak in the roof of her quarters and check for a leak in the pipes, as she could smell gas. Ralph said this wouldn't be a problem, and he collected the prisoner's name and cell number and walked through the corridors and down the wings to collect him. On meeting the man, Ralph could see he was around 33 years old, about 5 foot tall with narrow grey eyes and dark brown hair. Ralph thought he looked quite average, but if it wasn't for all the scars this inmate had, he wouldn't have stood out. He had one down his nose, one on his face, and a large one running down the left side of his neck. He paused for a moment then said to the inmate, "We're off fixing this roof, but I'll have no messing around." The prisoner said that was fine. The two men walked into the workshops to get the tools that they needed to do the job, and then out into the courtyard, as the pipes and the roof that were needed to be fixed was on a house used by the prison matron, Miss Little, and was within the prison grounds, but backed onto the exterior wall. Ralph took out his keys and unlocked the door, and followed the prisoner up a narrow wooden staircase to the first floor, where he unlocked another door. Both men went inside, and at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, the matron arrived to the house and sat in the parlour, which is directly below the room that they were working in. She heard a loud thud, and immediately she became suspicious, and she got up to go and check on the two men. When reaching the top of the stairs, she placed a hand on the round brass door handle. She found the door was locked. She called for Ralph. She got no reply. She called again, and then a muffled reply called, "All right," but there was no attempt to unlock the door. She raced down the stairs and out into the main prison to raise the alarm. She called for help and 3 wardens arrived. They kicked and slammed into the door to force it open. When they broke it down, they were completely in shock at the scene before them. When Webb's colleagues made their way into the room, on the floor was Webb. He was found mortally wounded with severe injuries to the head, in which had been caused by a blunt instrument. They searched the room, but there was no sign of Jackson, just a hole smashed into the ceiling, which pointed to his escape route. He had gained access to the roof and lowered himself into Southall Street, on the other side of the prison's external wall, along which he made his escape. Webb was taken to the prison hospital, where he succumbed to his injuries, and he died 2 hours later. While preparing the body, it was discovered that 9 shillings and 6 pence had been stolen from Webb's pockets, and his boots and his sock and a knife were also missing. A massive manhunt began immediately, but Jackson had left the vicinity and evaded his pursuers. The hunt for Jackson would eventually hit the newspapers, and it gripped the country, and was avidly followed by the press. On Friday the 25th of May 1888, an inquest into the 45-year-old Ralph Webb's death was held. Major Preston, the prison's governor, confirmed that on Jackson's arrival at Strangeways prison, the warrant was accompanied by a certificate from the police, saying that he had no previous convictions. The prison therefore had no knowledge of his criminal history or his past escape from Wakefield jail. It had not therefore been thought necessary to make any special arrangements. It also turns out they didn't have a photo of Jackson, or even his real name, and because of this, it wasn't Strangeways prison's fault he had escaped. Sadly, it was also revealed, at the exact time that the murder took place, a colleague was on his way to relieve Webb, who was due to have his tea break. Webb was buried a few days later at Salford Cemetery. The hearse left his home and made his way along Chapel Street, Oldfield Road, Regent Road, and Eccles New Road, where the cemetery was located. In the hearse was Webb's uniform, cap, and belt. They lay amongst the floral tributes on the coffin lid. The hearse was escorted by fellow warders dressed in full uniform with black armbands, and crowds lined the street to express their sympathies for the widow and their 6-year-old daughter. Initially, the police were not informed of Webb's death until some time later. On finding out, immediate steps were taken by the Rising Star Chief Detective Inspector Caminada. To trace the murderer, Caminada had all the likely hiding spots searched in Manchester. And in the process, he gained a tip-off that Jackson had gone to Oldham. Caminada and several other officers raced to Oldham in pursuit of Jackson, but they could find no sign of him. They informed the Oldham police that the fugitive was likely to break into houses in order to obtain food and different clothes. This proved to be accurate, as the Oldham police later revealed that 8 days earlier, 2 successful burglaries and 2 unsuccessful attempts had taken place. One house that was broken into was on Park Road, from which had been stolen a black Chesterfield overcoat, white linen jacket, and a brown tweed vest, a stone bottle containing half a gallon of porter and some cigars. There was little doubt to who the intruder was, because at the scene of the crime had been left a prison-issue stocking and one of Warder Webb's socks. The other house that had been broken into was that of Salvation Army Captain Thomas Woods, who lived at Cromwell Street, Oldham, from which Jackson stole a tweed coat, £1 16s. He also took the keys to the Salvation Army barracks, where he stayed for some time, as the police found an empty bottle of porter and some partially smoked cigars. Pieces of cotton were also found, which was similar to the lining of the linen jacket stolen from Park Road. Also, they found a heavy hammer and 3 different types of screwdrivers, which were thought to have been used to gain access into the houses. Captain Wood's house had previously been broken into, and it was now believed that Jackson had also been the culprit on that occasion. Considering the awful crime that Jackson had just committed, his second break-in at Wood's home was seen as extremely audacious. He ransacked the house upstairs and downstairs, smoked some of the man's cigars, and he left the captain a note on the table, which read, "Goodbye, Captain, though lost to sight, to memory dear, yours truly, Shakespeare." Again, on the 25th of May, the Manchester Guardian had a report of the previous day's events in the search for Jackson. It was reported that the pawnbroker in Leeds had told Oldham police that a man had pawned a jacket in his shop. It turned out to be the one that had been stolen by Jackson from Park Road in Oldham. The pawnbroker was also able to describe the clothing worn by the man, and it was obvious that it matched the descriptions of the other clothing stolen in the same raid. The new description was sent to Manchester Police, from there to the rest of the country. All the resources from the Manchester Police Detectives Department were being utilised in the hunt for Jackson, and the county force as well, as technically the murder had been committed within the jurisdiction of the county force, as the jail was by Act of Parliament constituted a portion of the county. On the 26th of May, the newspaper reported the police governor again said the prison could take no blame, as they didn't know he was dangerous, as they had no other convictions on record. And thanks to the press, sightings of Jackson were now coming from all over the country, with arrests of lookalikes being made. Chief Detective Inspector Caminada and a prison warder from Strangeways had to travel to check if the arrested men were indeed the right man. More details about the true identity of John Jackson and his crimes were published on the 31st of May. The Bradford police were positively convinced that his real name was Charles Wood Firth, and had also discovered a list of his known aliases, which were Charles Williamson Firth, Charles Wood, Charles Wilson, Charles Kitson, John Jackson, Edward Graham, Fred Smith, and many others. He was also wanted for forgery in Dewsbury, as well as for a large number of robberies and burglaries in West Riding in Yorkshire. Bradford police had also managed to obtain a photograph of the wanted man. Copies of this photograph were made and immediately posted in Bradford town, together with an exact description. Age, about 33 years, height, 5 foot 5 inches, grey eyes, dark brown hair, a cut mark on his nose, a scar on the left side of his neck and face, a lump and scar on the left side of his forefinger on his left hand. Meanwhile, the search for Jackson continued. Although he might have made tracks for anywhere in the country, it was thought he had remained in Manchester, or, more likely, gone to his native Yorkshire. The police kept watch at race meetings, and again there was many supposed sightings of the man. For instance, someone reported him drinking in an Oldham pub on the night of the escape. Police were called to an inn at Greengate, Salford, where Jackson was said to be drinking. He was also reported to be begging in Ortal, another district of Salford. However, all these proved to be false leads. Jackson was now like a ghost, appearing everywhere. But on Friday, 15th of June 1888, he was arrested. He was held in police custody for several hours before his true identity was even discovered. This is when he confessed to the police. He said that having reached the roof of the matron's house, he lowered himself onto the roof of a lower building, from which he easily reached the prison's perimeter wall. He spotted 2 boys and asked them if there was anyone about. On being told there was no one in the area, he dropped 10 feet onto the cobbled street and made for Red Bank. which was a densely populated district, heavily overcrowded with dark, filthy back alleys and frequently used by criminals. He insisted that he had not known of Webb's death until the following day, and shortly after his escape he borrowed a coat from a friendly pub landlord, having stolen a hat of a young boy, who was later found crying in the street. He pulled down his hat and tucked up his coat collar and made his way to Oldham. He was seen by two young girls who informed the police. While in Oldham, he committed the reported burglaries and later travelled to Halifax, where he shaved off his moustache and then moved between Leeds and Halifax before deciding to stay in Bradford. He survived by stealing and admitted burglary in Horton. He decided to go to Bradford, where he was not known. He used the name Thomas Harrison and spent much of his time drinking in local public houses. His resemblance to the fugitive was not unnoticed and commented on, as many wanted posters had been circulating through the north of England. He managed to avoid suspicion by making a joke out of looking like the wanted man. And the real reason he was actually arrested was because he was lodging with a man named Booth, but moved out after just a few days. But at 1 o'clock in the morning on Monday the 11th of June, he came back to rob Mr. Booth. But he accidentally woke him and saw Mr. Booth's face at the bedroom window. Booth shouted out the window at him. He turned and ran and cut through the yard of a nearby inn, and he hid himself in a privy, which is an outside toilet. Suddenly, the door flies open and Mr. Booth has him. He's raining down blows on Mr. Jackson. There was a fierce struggle. During this, Jackson suffered a severe cut to his head, which stunned him. Police Constable Flood was passing, and upon hearing the disturbance went to the scene. He arrested Jackson and escorted him to the police office, where he was held overnight. He gave his name as Thomas Harrison, a joiner from Garnet Street in Bradford, and he was searched and found to have a small amount of loose change and a knife in his possession. At 9:30 the following morning, Detective Talbot made his routinely daily inspection of the overnight arrests. Talbot's suspicions were immediately aroused by the prisoner Harrison, who so closely matched the description of Jackson, the Strangeways fugitive. He noticed a distinct mark on the prisoner's finger and asked him to remove some of his clothing. There were more physical similarities, namely the scar on his neck. To confirm the prisoner's identity, Talbot visited Birstall and brought Jackson's two brothers, Alfred and Harry, to identify him. He appeared in chains before the local magistrates on Tuesday, the 12th of June, his subdued demeanour reflecting his desperate situation. A detective from Manchester, Detective Graham, sought for the prisoner to be sent back to Manchester, and on this, Jackson rested his arms on the dock and lay his head on them, never looking up. He was taken to Manchester, and on the following day appeared at Manchester Police Court, where he was committed for trial at the next Manchester Assizes. The trial took place on Friday, the 13th of July, 1888, and was attended by a large number of spectators, including a group of ladies, who found seats close to the prisoner, who was now a celebrity. He seemed aware of his fate from the beginning. He looked sad and solitary. The prosecutor, Mr. Addison, gave the details of the case. The dying warder found in the matron's room, the hole in the ceiling, the missing prisoner, and the alleged confession made to the police in Bradford after his capture. As the evidence mounted, Jackson seemed to visibly shrink in the dock. He rarely raised his eyes, other than when apparently trying to read the judge's expressions. One particularly dramatic moment during the prosecution's evidence was when the appearance of the victim's widow, Mrs. Webb, who was called to confirm that the knife found in Jackson's possession in Bradford had belonged to her late husband. And the defence was led by Mr. Wharton, who put forward the insane theory that the injuries to Webb had been caused accidentally, as he stood up suddenly, having knelt down to smell for gas after the repair. As he did so, he banged his own head against the hammer that Jackson was just holding in his hand. As this ingenious theory continued, Jackson looked over towards the jury, more in hope than expectation, but this fell on deaf ears. After just 7 minutes, the jury returned with the inevitable guilty verdict. whereupon Jackson slumped forward in the dock, covering his face with a handkerchief. Asked by the clerk if he had anything to say before a sentence was passed, he responded in a scarcely audible voice that he did not intend to kill Webb. The judge then sentenced him to death. The execution was scheduled for 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning on the 7th of August 1888, and by 7:30 a crowd of 1,000 people had gathered outside the Strangeways prison gates. Silence fell over the crowd. As 8 a.m. approached, the silence was broken by the sound of the town hall clock striking the hour, which was quickly followed by the shrill clanging of the prison bell, confirming that the execution had been carried out. This was followed by the raising of a black flag on the prison flagpole. It was reported he had gone to bed at 8 o'clock, but slept very little, tossing and turning, having a restless night. At 6 a.m. he had breakfast of bread and butter, and was later attended by Reverend Draper. Reverend Draper, who lately described the condemned man as being undoubtedly and most sincerely penitent. The chaplain also later confirmed that Jackson had admitted to him that he had deliberately hit Webb on the side of his head. And at 7:57, the executioner James Berry entered the condemned cell. He shook hands with the prisoner, who by now was pale and sweating. Jackson was then pinioned, where his hands were tied behind his back. He was taken from his cell and led 10 paces to the scaffold, where he was placed on the drop. Jackson's lips were seen to be moving, but he uttered no sound. A white hood was placed over his head, and as Reverend Draper said, "Have mercy upon this man's soul," the lever was pulled, the drop opened, and Jackson died immediately due to the fractured neck caused by hanging. Jackson's father, John Firth of Hudders Road, Birstall, petitioned the Home Secretary prior to the execution to have his son's remains returned to him for burial. This was refused, which meant that Jackson was executed and buried on the same site as the murder he committed. Well, that will do it for today, but let me know what you thought of the story. I thought it was a little sad that he was minutes from going on his break, and I thought it was crazy how fast he almost became a mythical figure, with stories and sightings popping up all over, and how Jackson's escapades whilst on the run kept the country enthralled. The news ran almost daily stories of what occurred whilst he was on the run. He was clearly a charismatic man, and apparently a renowned amateur vocalist, and whilst evading capture, he supposedly spent a good deal of time in Bradford's White Bear Inn singing, while on the wall behind him was his wanted poster with all the details of the murder. He was said to have broken into a house in Beech Grove in Bradford, where he slept in the absent householder's bed overnight, and upon leaving in the morning he waved a cheery farewell to the neighbours, and in another house he broke into, he dined on a meal of cold mutton and salad before washing his hair. These stories were believed to have been made up, but they contributed to the mystique and what the press called almost unheard of coolness of the man. I hope you enjoyed that, but also, if you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for your support, and take care.